having taken up human rights as a calling for myself, and having dealt with this issue for almost 3 decades now, I would like to bring some of the essential factors, and particularly this year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and there is a lot of activities going on across the world to mark this. I want to bring in a little bit of the historical, the political and the ethical factors that really led to the coming of this Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's not just a gift given by God, but it was a product of a very serious dilemma that human beings have faced. We are facing a similar dilemma today. I was actually in New York just a week ago, and there the Secretary General have now come up with a document called the New Agenda for Peace, and they have now realized that the UN itself is reaching a breaking point, because the most important job that it was meant to do, meaning bringing security to the world, stopping a war, is constantly eroding. And now we are reaching a point which they call either it's going to be a breakdown or a breakthrough. And the challenge for us today is how to make a situation which could be a breakdown into a breakthrough to bring about that change. And I will take you to that moment of history where the world was actually facing a much more serious breakdown than we are imagining today. I will take you to 1941, when almost the entire Europe was taken over by the Nazi Germany. England was the only one that was left to be ruled by the so-called free world. And Winston Churchill defined that time as the best hour of Britain. They were constantly facing, aerial raid by the German forces. Even here in Northeast India, Myanmar was already taken over by the Japanese, and the INA was marching into India, and we were in a very precarious situation even here. Churchill was constantly asking the Americans to come and help them in the Second World War. You all know, right? This was fought between the Allied and the Axis, and the Allied was basically America. America came a little later. So he was constantly requesting America to come on board, come on board. I'm sure you must have seen many films and stories and read books about it. America was reluctant. Why should we put our money and our people in a war where there's a huge Atlantic that is stopping? But Pearl Harbor bombing brought about a change, and for the first time, as mentioned earlier, President Roosevelt agreed that we will join the war. And Winston Churchill was the happiest person. He came out in a ship from Britain. President Roosevelt was coming from the other side of Atlantic, and they met in the sea in Atlantic near what you call the Newfound Island. And it was a Sunday morning where Winston Churchill wrote on a piece of paper on his ship 10 points which he think was essential for. There were many things about military collaboration, everything, but in that, then the Americans were given, Roosevelt was given, American civil servant had to look at it, and they agreed, and they signed on a Sunday morning. Instead of going to the church, they signed a document at such hurry, which became the most important document of the generations to come. And this is what we call the Atlantic Charter. Among other military elements, there were two very important elements which it says: the right of the people to choose the form of government they want to be ruled by. This is totally in contrary to what the Axis is doing. Whenever the Axis go and control, it becomes their territory. They embezzle wealth. It becomes under the Hitler's control. This time what they were saying is, if the Allied win, it will be a totally different world. Wherever we come and take control, it will not be an Allied force who will be in control. You yourself will be in control. You decide what is the nature of the government, the form of government you want. And they make a very tall promise again, that what we are going to do is to create a pledge, a hope of a world where there will be, everyone will enjoy the freedom from want and freedom from fear. Your basic needs will be taken care of. They said that they didn't guarantee that we'll give you, but we say this is the hope of a world that we look forward to. This is the world that we want to build if we win the war. And freedom from fear, meaning government will not come down and say this is right and this is wrong. You do what you want. You respect your liberty, the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. It is the duty of the government to respect it, not to kind of tell you do this, do that. I mean, this was a very, very tall promise, and in a time, this is a bit like an election manifesto, right? Because it was a war, and immediately after this Atlantic Charter was given out, probably General Slim must be still planning how to stop the Japanese from coming in Kangla, in Imphal at that time, but they must have also got the wireless messages at that time. Even we were in the middle of the war. Unfortunately, we didn't enjoy the fruit of the war, the human rights. We have to wait for another half a century. I'll come to that, how human rights movement started. But the essence of human rights begin with the Atlantic Charter. This has triggered a lot of people, a lot of nations, 26 nations came together within a few months, and they said, we are all here to preserve human rights and justice in our own land as well as in others. And they joined the Allied. Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, they were also in the middle of the freedom struggle here. They all welcomed the Atlantic Charter, and they came out, when these 26 countries came and declared this UN declaration, they were all in support of them. Fortunately, the tide of the war slowly turned. So what we need to understand is the struggle, the fight in the Second World War is not just about guns. It is also about the idea of a supremacist race needing to control the world as the Aryan race, or a world which is based on basic fundamental principles of equality, freedom and justice. And in fact, it was not only the colonial world of the Asia and Africa who came up and triggered by this idea, but even the Europeans were under the Nazis' rule. So there was in the UK at that time, there was a group called PEN International, PEN, writing about freedom of expression. So they would go to Europe and drop not bombs, but the ideas of freedom, of human rights. So it was not just bombs that was dropped in Europe during the Second World War, but pamphlets were also dropped. So that when people in Norway, in Sweden, under the Nazi read this, they know that there is a brighter world, beyond this dark cloud of total dictatorship, total control of the Nazis. So one has to remember, it is this idea, once the genie is let loose, it's very difficult to bring it back. The idea of freedom went wild in the middle of the war. It was not coming in a nice thesis that was written in an academic council. It has come in the heart of the struggle of the Second World War. And fortunately, the war slowly came in favor of the Allied. And at that time, 1944, the major countries of the world, at that time, what is now the permanent members of the United Nations the Security Council, but France was still not able to put its act together. It was US, the USSR, China, and UK sat in a colonial home near to Washington DC, and they start writing the first draft of what is going to come, the new international body that's going to come, what we now call the United Nations. And this was called the Dumbarton-Ock proposal. But what is very interesting is, like all politicians, even those statesmen politicians of the Second World War, they started turning around. And they said, well, if we give this self-determination to all these people, Churchill himself turned around and said, then my God, these are just words. But if we actually allow the rest of the world to exercise self-determination, then this vast commonwealth is going to crumble. So they stopped talking about human rights. Interestingly, only one government was insisting that we are ready to surrender our sovereignty. Sir was mentioning about how the need for balancing sovereignty was so important. The only power out of these four powers who discussed the Dumbarton Ock kind of charter, or the draft charter, was China. China said we are ready to surrender as much sovereignty for justice internationally. But the other countries were not ready to give that concession, and so the word human rights was mentioned only in the economic and social cooperation part, not in the central part of it. This actually triggered a lot of anger from the middle and smaller countries around the world. Australia and New Zealand was the first to say, no, we need to review this draft and we need to include the principles that was already assigned in the Atlantic Charter and the UN Declaration earlier. Similarly, the Latin American countries came and met in Mexico, and they said, no, this is not a war only of the big powers. This was a war, it's a people's war. And people's war requires that the principle on which you have brought us into the war needs to be taken up seriously. Then came the actual writing of the United Nations Charter. In 1945, in San Francisco, 50 countries came together and they started writing the Charter of the United Nations. And interestingly, unlike in the Paris World Peace Treaty, which was formed after the First World War, where only governments were involved, this time round when they were in San Francisco, it was not only the government, but the civil society was also involved. And the civil society, more than the United States government, it was the United States civil society who shouted down on their government that if you don't take up this historical moment seriously, you are denying your historical role as a champion of freedom and right. As Professor Mukhopadhyay was saying, sometimes there's also a lot of hypocrisy within the Western government of what they speak and what they actually do. So when the State Department people were trying to come out with a document on the same principle as the Dumbarton Ock principle, the civil society, including retired judges, were bombarding them with, your responsibility, historical responsibility to take this up. And fortunately, when the United Nations Charter was written, they included the word human rights as a key principle around which the United Nations will be formed. First, of course, is security of the world, no war. They have been able to so far stop the world from going to a third world war. I don't know what's going to come in the next 5 years, but so far they have been successful. Second is human rights, that human rights should be protected irrespective of where you are. Just because you are a human being, you are entitled to certain rights, and this will be protected not only by your government, but the collective of all the governments in the world in the form of United Nations. This becomes a very important, this becomes the central point of having peace in the world. And of course the development, the sustainable development and all that. And sometimes we in India don't realize the role that our own Indians have played in this. The first draft amendment in the United Nations to include human rights was proposed by none other than Vijayalakshmi Pandit herself, who was, India was not yet totally free, but the delegation was already there when the UN Charter was being worked out, and Vijayalakshmi Pandit actually proposed this statement to amend the Dumbarton Ock proposal, and says fundamental human rights of all men and women, irrespective of race, color or creed. In all nations and in international relations, an association of nations with one another is the proposal that Vijayalakshmi Pandit placed before the UN Charter Committee. And then soon in 1945 the charter came, and these are the words of we the peoples of the United Nations. Unlike the high contracting parties of the League of the Nations, this is not just the government but also peoples of the world that will be incorporated as the owner of this document, and to save the succeeding generations from the scourges of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm the faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of human person, in the equal rights of men and women of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligation arising from treaties and other sources of international law may be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standard of life in larger freedom. So the United Nations Charter is not just a power balancing mechanism of states, but it's also saying that every human being's freedom, fundamental rights needs to be protected, and that is the basis of peace in the world. Interestingly, again, I want to re-emphasize, remind ourselves of the historical moment that India played. In the first General Assembly of the United Nations in 1945, the charter was made, and in 1946, when they said for the first time, again there, Vijayalakshmi Pandit brought about a proposal condemning the South Africa. We all know South Africa, there was a racist regime, an apartheid regime, where there was the white were privileged and the colored people and the black people were things. So Vijayalakshmi Pandit again brought out a resolution saying, accusing the South Africa for its policies of grossly violating the basic human rights of Indians and other with dark skin color, in total contradiction to principle and purpose of the Charter. To this, the South African ambassador was very angry and shouted at Vijayalakshmi Pandit and quoted Article 2, Clause 7, which talks about sovereign impunity, that every country is independent of each other, and this is an internal affair where you have no business to interfere in our thing. Vijayalakshmi Pandit got up and again said, Ambassador, you are a little late in the day. If this was 1944, it could have been the correct position of international law, not after the Charter of the United Nations has come about. So, for the first time, and then it resulted into very furious debate inside the General Assembly, and for the first time, it has become established that the way the government treat their own people is no longer the business of that country alone. The idea of sovereign impunity, that I will do what I want in my country, is no longer true so long as it touches the dignity and respect and fundamental rights of human beings. Other countries, the United Nations, have a right to say and have an obligation to say things which is, and this is a principle established by no other country than our own country, India. Now we are having some problems with it, but we'll discuss that a little later. Then what is interesting is, again, it's all fine to say when human rights is touched, then we will deal with internationally. But for heaven's sake, what are these human rights? For the first time, the same Human Rights Council was constituted in 1946. The first General Assembly constituted a Human Rights Council to draft a document to list out what are the human rights. Easier said than done. We all said human rights, human rights, human rights, but what are these human rights? Where, again, Vijayalakshmi Pandit have already pointed out in the very first assembly that if you violate this, others can come and talk about it. Now, how to write and what will be the content of this human rights was something that was the first task that was given to the Human Rights Council, Human Rights Commission it was called at that time. And the Human Rights Commissions, when they started writing, there was so much debate. The Shariat law people, the Muslim country would say everything is there in the Shariat law. From the time you wake up to the time you sleep, everything is written. The Confucians from China will come, will say 5,000 years ago Confucian have already written what is necessary. So that itself, the philosophical basis of on what ground, and of course the Marxists will come and say this is all dialectic materialism, nothing else. So even to come out with a philosophical kind of grounding of human rights was a big problem. So they took help from UNESCO, and UNESCO actually wanted to have a conference to discuss this. But at that time, the UN was itself so poor, the whole world was limping back to normal after the Second World War. They couldn't have a conference, and so what they did was they distributed questionnaires. 150 prominent people across the world were given questionnaire to fill up and say, what do you think should be the philosophical basis of human rights? In India, 2 persons got this questionnaire. One was Jawaharlal Nehru, the other one was Mahatma Gandhi. Unfortunately, Jawaharlal Nehru was too busy at that time, partition, new government, the riots that was happening. He didn't have the time, so he never returned back the questionnaire. Mahatma Gandhi found time, probably when he was traveling in a train, he asked his person to write, and he said something like, the real right will come when you perform your duty, and the real right will be enjoyed only when you perform your duty. So the whole dichotomy of right and duty was there in Mahatma Gandhi's mind, and this is part of the UN archives, and very interesting things are now coming up. The other point is, in the actual drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, there was also a very interesting lady from India which was present. Do any of us know that the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights involved an Indian? I don't think not many. This is not too much of a public knowledge. And he made very fundamental contributions. These are the ladies who are involved in the declaration, and you can see the Indian lady was starkly different from all those very privileged Western ladies. The lady in the far corner, right-hand corner is Hansat Mehta. She was a Congress lady, many times in jail. None of these ladies are in jail. They were all in palaces, and she was there. And she made two fundamental changes, which is very fundamental to the declaration. First one was that the Americans and the French, they want to take their own Declaration of Rights of Men, the wordings from it, they pluck it from there and want to insert it in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So the first wording, which was read also here, was, all men are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Hansat Mehta raised her hand and said, Madam, the chair was Eleanor Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's wife, because President Roosevelt, just before the United Nations was formed, died. But he was the one who originally brought the idea. So as an honor, Eleanor Roosevelt was the one who was chairing the drafting committee. Hansat Mehta said, why men? What about the women? So the women question was asked. Eleanor Roosevelt was trying to explain, madam, but when we say men here, it means common, both men and women. And Hansat Mehta's response was, and therefore, why not human? So if you look at the first line of the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It was India's contribution to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Unfortunately, we are too ready to say that these are all Western concepts. But the first word came from an Indian mind, from an Indian culture. The second element, which again was very fundamental, was both these declarations, French as well as Americans, were referring to God as the source of human dignity. She said, well, we also have atheists here, we also have communists here, we also have socialists here. They don't quite agree whether God agrees or not, but what is important is that what is fundamental is human nature rather than God. So drop the reference to God, and instead it talks about inherent dignity and of equal and inalienable right of all persons of human family. That is the basis of human dignity. So I think these are very fundamental philosophical questions which needs to be reminded, and we all need to understand and appreciate this when we, as as not only as a citizen of the world, even as a citizen of India, how closely linked the idea of human rights is to India's own tradition, culture and struggle. And this was actually around the same time that the Constituent Assembly was drafting the Constitution. In New York and in Paris, they were busy drafting this, and Hansat Mehta was actually involved in the drafting of the Constitution herself. So there was a very, even in terms of time, there was a clear correlation. So what we now call as civil and political rights is what we call as part 3 of the Indian Constitution as fundamental right. And what we call today as social, economic and cultural rights in the international terminology is what we put as part 4 in the directive principles of state policy. So if you read the Indian Constitution and the fundamental part 3 and part 4, you are already reading the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as well as the covenants that they came. So anyway, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was finally adopted in Paris on the 10th of October 1948. But interestingly, the debate was not over. Even at the last moment when Eleanor Roosevelt was trying to table this resolution, USSR was saying, let us defer this for 1 more year because we need to still debate some more issues. But Eleanor Roosevelt said, no, we have already discussed this for 2 years. Now she placed it for voting. Interestingly, none of the 56 government present there dare to vote against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but 8 of them abstained from voting, which includes Russia, some of our allies, and some of the Muslim countries in the Middle East. They were not very happy with this equality that given on men and women. They have some reservations around it, but nobody voted against it. And then late in the evening it was adopted, and the whole General Assembly rose and gave a kind of a standing ovation to Eleanor Roosevelt, also to honor, remember the Atlantic Charter and Roosevelt played in that Sunday morning with Winston Churchill few years ago, and that it resulted into this document. And this is perhaps the first document. It's not just a promise, it's a pledge by at the highest level that is given to every human being in this world, not only which was born and living in 1948, but even for generations to come. I don't think any of us were born in 1948. I don't know if some of the professors were, but it would be very unlikely. But this is a promise that is given, and for the first time, I don't know how many millions of years Homo sapien have worked on this earth, but for the first time, at the highest level, there is a pledge that all human beings deserve to be treated like this. And it was a promise at the top level. It is not yet realized, it is still work to be done, but it is already clearly written that this is the minimum requirement in which every human being ought to be treated. And there was a consensus at the international and the highest level, and all the government have accepted it. This was how it was born, and it is its 75th birthday that we are celebrating this week. Let's say it's a few days already past, and very interestingly, there was also many celebrations that took place across the world. There were the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now there is a High Commissioner at the level of the very high level in the UN hierarchy, where the High Commissioner looks into how human rights is disseminated around the world, how it is promoted, and and they are gathering pledges from all over the world. I think 153 countries have now given their pledge of how to make this Universal Declaration a reality, and also many, not only NGOs, but even individuals. If we have met a little earlier, you could have also sent your pledges to an email. Oh, this is my pledges. And they are building a huge tree of pledges in in Geneva, in the High Commissioner's office, and they are going to put all of this, digest this, and next year there's going to be a summit for the future in 2024, and they are going to work out a plan of the remaining 25 years for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to become 100 years, and how much it is realized. They're going to come out with a work plan, a global work plan on how to make this unfinished work in progress, given a further impetus. So we'll come to that, but now we will reflect a little bit on what it means for this region of the world. For lack of a proper term, we call it the Northeast India. We are in Guwahati, and what does it mean for us, this Universal Declaration on Human Rights, right? What is important is for us to understand a little bit. I'm sure many of you from political science and law must have known that the task that was given to the Human Rights Council was two. One was to write a declaration, which is a wish, a pledge, an expression of will and desire, but it was also asked to draft another covenant. Covenant is a binding legal treaty, more than just legal, but also there is a moral obligation for us to follow this. So while trying to draft a much more detailed document called covenant and not just a declaration, we all know like the 10 commandments and things like that, right? Covenant is not just legal but also moral. So some level of morality is also present. So when we tried to draft this covenant, the world very quickly got divided into two. The Western European democratic bloc led by America and its allies, and the more Soviet bloc, or the Eastern bloc, which is more socialistic in this philosophy and thinking. And so these division in the world also resulted into division in the debate around human rights. So there was this question of which one is more important. Is it your right to food, which is economic, social and cultural rights, or your right to say, I'm hungry, I want food? Which one do you think is more important? Any of the students? I think both of them are equally important, right? If you don't have one, you will not have the other. But anyway, it was a real debate in the UN, and it took much longer for them to resolve, and finally the consensus was, rather than having one human rights covenant, it ended up having two human rights covenant. One championed by the American and his allies, called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which talks about right to freedom of association, assembly, expression, right to participation, right to vote, etc., etc. And the International Covenant on Civil and Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. These are all rich men's rights. What we need is roti, kapra or makan. We need food, we need shelter, we need home. Only then we will talk about all those rich men's rights. So the Soviet bloc came out with this, and so we ended up having two covenants, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These three documents, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, these three documents became what is known as the International Bill of Rights. Very interestingly, many other specific rights also sir, I understand you have to be for the academic
council meetings.
We understand, sir. No issues, sir.
We'll catch up later.
Definitely.
Definitely.
So now that the professors are gone, we can be even a little more informal. We can say all human beings are equal, all human beings are equal. But we know that some people are not exactly equal. We are talking about how George Washington was having all his slaves when he was signing the Declaration of Man. So if you don't have a clear policy of how to make these slaves equal to its masters, if you assume that all men are free, born and equal, then this difference will continue forever. So we have to look specifically to the specific problem. So the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination came into being in 1965, even before the two covenants came into being. Similarly, you might say men and women are equal, but we all know, if you look at our own family life, we look at the academic life, we look at the freedom of movement in Guwahati city, there's a slight difference between the way men enjoys their freedom and women enjoys their freedom, right? And Guwahati is little better. If you go to Delhi, you know how stark it becomes. If you go to Haryana, you'll become clearer. So no point saying all human beings are equal. The way in which women are discriminated over years and decades and millennia requires very specific policies and programs to eliminate this discrimination against women. So came the International Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We all say we are all equal. If you leave the child which was born 2 hours ago here and me and say we leave you alone because you are equal, then the child will ultimately die, right? Because it doesn't have the capacity that I have. So children also needs a very specific right, and it's called the right to protection, right to development. So your right to protection as you grow older slowly give way to right to liberty, that you become free. So children also requires very specific rights. So came the Convention on Rights of the Child. Migrant workers, both the ones that we receive here, but also the ones that have gone. Many of our children have gone and worked in IT industries in the West. How are they being treated? Are they treated equally? Many of our brothers and sisters are working in the Middle East. Are they actually being treated equal? Do they have specific rights that needs to be taken care of as to live as equal human beings? Those are areas that Convention on Migrant Workers are looking at. India have not signed it. Right against torture. The introduction also mentions about how torture continues to be a very serious matter, both by state as well as non-state actors, and how do we tackle it. India have signed this convention way back in 1997, but it failed to ratify it. You know, international conventions has to be signed and then ratified, meaning that it should be made as a part of your law. India have signed it in 1997, but it has not ratified it till today. Person with disabilities, India had signed it, ratified it, and it's part of our law. So that is why all buildings have to have ramps now, so that people who are differently able will also be able to enjoy their basic dignity and right. They should not be dependent on the mercy and sympathy of other people all the time. They have a right to enter into public institutions without challenges to the access. Enforced disappearances. Have you heard this in Assam? Some time ago, we heard about how Ulfa guys' bodies were never found from the Bhutan operations. In Manipur, we have plenty of cases. Secret killings is one. All this requires clear international standards to be followed. The government, because they were involved in it, probably in perpetration of these crimes, cannot run away from it. India has not signed this yet. India had signed it, in 2007, but not ratified it yet. So it's not yet a part of the law of India. What does it mean? I mean, when you sign a covenant or a convention, what does it mean? These are standards. It's like the law, guidelines or standards that needs to be followed. And the government is saying that we are ready to follow these standards. So what they do is they basically, government have to, after they sign the convention or a human rights treaty, they have to give a report to a committee in the UN, group of experts, and say this is how we are actually trying to implement this. This is how we are actually trying to remove torture in police custody. Supreme Court judgments, NHRC guidelines. These are the activities that we are doing. And then the committee will look at it, and the committee will also invite information from NGOs or individuals. And this is where we as civil society can also play a very important role. You can actually write a report on those principles. Article 1 is saying no torture, Article 2 is saying if they were tortured, there should be proper investigation. Article 3 is saying that that medical treatment should be available. 4 is saying there should be compensation. 5 is saying etc. etc. You can actually write your real life experience that you see in your own surrounding, and you can submit this to the UN. The UN experts will read both this report, what the government is saying, what the NGOs are saying, and they will ask questions to the government to answer. Well, you know, Your Excellency, we really appreciate that you have passed this law or this judgment, but this gentleman from Nagaon, from Upper Assam, or they might not put your name because you will be in danger then, we have information from reliable sources that Mr. Lachit Brodoloi was arrested on such and such days. He was tortured, but he was never given a medical examination as per your law. What is the mechanism in which you ensure that these laws are actually implemented, for example, right? And then the government will say, no, that was a mistake, we did it, this must be anti-national people who are trying to give a bad name to us, blah, 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 blah. And then finally, after the debate, they will come out with certain recommendation. They will come out with recommendation to say, they will also appreciate the government for having done this and this. However, we are concerned that these laws are more in words than its actual implementation. And for the government to do this actual implementation, you should empower whatever, the Assam State Human Rights Commission to get reports from every police station on how this is done. For example, you know, these are some of the examples. We have been fighting for a long time on the issue of Armed Forces Special Powers Act. You must have heard about it, right? If you heard about a lady called Irom Sharmila. So with her, we have been struggling around this issue, and we got some very good recommendations from some of these UN committees. You know. The committee that looks into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is called Human Rights Committee, because in a way it's the most important human rights. So the Human Rights Committee have come out with certain recommendations pertaining to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And I'm putting it up, oh my God, this one. The committee remains concerned at the continuing reliance on special powers under legislation such as Armed Forces Special Powers Act, blah, 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 declared disturbed and at serious human rights violation, in particular in respect to Articles 6, 7, 9 and 14. Now you need to know what the Article 6, 7, 9 and 14 is talking about. Article 6 is about right to life. People can be killed arbitrarily. Article 7 is no torture. You can't torture people. They are saying we are having reports that people are being tortured under Armed Forces Special Powers. Article 9 is talking about arbitrary detention. People cannot be detained without proper due procedure. But we all know in Northeast how when you are picked up, you are picked up. There's nobody can ask questions, right? Article 14 is about right to fair trial. That everybody who is accused of a crime should have a proper trial in proper tribunal, proper designated court. So these are all conflated. Of the covenant committed by security and armed forces acting under the laws, as well as by paramilitary and insurgent groups. The committee, noting that the examination of the constitutionality of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act pending before the Supreme Court is due to be heard in August 1997, hopes that its provision will be examined for their compatibility with the Covenant. In this respect, bearing in mind the provisions of Article 1, 19 and 25 of the Covenant, the committee endorses the view of the National Human Rights Commission that the problems in areas affected by terrorism and armed insurgency are essentially political in character, and that the appropriate approach to resolving such problem must also essentially be political, and emphasize that terrorism should be fought with means that are compatible with the Covenant. Very long legal terms, but I hope you get the essence of it. What it is saying is that, one, the Supreme Court should not only examine the constitutionality of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, but the covenant compatibility, meaning that does Armed Forces Special Powers Act provision comply to the requirements of the Government of India under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is also saying that the problems that is being faced in the so-called insurgency and militant area are basically political problems. And to solve that, the approach should be not just sending military and killing people, but it should also be a political way of trying to resolve that problem. These are very, very powerful words that has come from a UN Human Rights Committee. And in trying to bring about that political solution, it is talking about Article, can you read this? 1, 19 and 25. Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is the most dangerous article of, which is called the right to self-determination. All peoples have the right to self-determination. This was the #1 promise of the Atlanta Charter, remember? Every people should be given the government of its choice. So Article 1 elaborates on it and then says, all people have the right to self-determination, by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic and social development. Article 19 is what you call freedom of expression. What is there in your tummy, what you feel, there should be space to be expressed freely. This is freedom of expression. Article 25 is effective participation in governance. Whether it is Tom, Dick or Harry which is ruling, Hitesh or Saikya, whoever it may be, Prafulla Kumar Mahanta, whoever is ruling, it is important that citizens should have a way to participate in that government. Effective participation. It's not just election and then finish, then 5 year again election and then finish. No, there should be effective participation of governance. The problems of insurgency can be solved if we respect right to self-determination, right to freedom of expression, and right to effective participation in governance. These are all basic fundamental human rights. Anyway, we'll go to the details for another day, but I just want to illustrate you, for example, this is how we can achieve, just by documenting, as Professor Barua was saying, if we document properly, if we know where to submit, instead of taking an AK-47 and killing people and getting killed, there are also ways to bring about change and things with the human rights strategy to get your message across. There is also the racial discrimination. There's a strong feeling that Northeast people are treated differently by the rest of the country, right? And the issue of racial discrimination also have stamped. If you look at the committee notes with concern, this was in 2007, the parties has not implemented the recommendation of the Committee to Review the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. This is the Jivan Reddy Committee. Have you heard about Jivan Reddy Committee? There's a committee set up by Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2004 after Hangzhou Manorama case and this Manipur protest in front of Kamla by the mothers to repeal Armed Forces Special Powers Act. But it was never implemented, under which members of the armed forces may be prosecuted unless such prosecution is authorized by the central government and have wide powers to search and arrest suspect without warrant or to use force against the person and properties in Manipur and other northeastern states which are inhabited by tribal people. The committee urges the state party to repeal the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and replace it by a more humane act in accordance with the recommendation contained in 2005 report of the review committee set up by the Union Home Ministry. It also requests the state party to release the report. So the Racial Discrimination Committee have urged the Government of India to repeal the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So this was again what 1,000 protests will not be able to achieve. The UN coming and yeah, I know it's getting a little late and you're a little tired, I can see that. So just to wind it up, as I was telling you earlier, this is the 75th anniversary and there's a lot of activities going on nowadays. There were high-level meetings in Vienna in June and again a high-level meeting which was just concluded day before yesterday on 11th and 12th and And there are many regional events in different parts of the world for Asia Pacific, for Africa, for Latin America, and so they are doing all these meetings. The Asian one was done in Bangkok in October, and I could just manage to go there. After my house was vandalized in Impala, I took a flight and went to Bangkok and participated in it. Sometimes it's nice to be in this big meeting, but at home your house is being vandalized, so sometimes it makes no sense. But anyway, these efforts do count, and this pledging tree, I was telling you, all the pledges that has come from 153 governments, thousands of NGOs and thousands of individuals are now put into a big tree, and this is going to be synthesized, and they are going to plan what is it that we can do to realize this Universal Declaration in the next 25 years when we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I hope some of us still survive then. Many of you might be quite old by then, but you can think about this moment where we've discussed this, that there is an effort at the global level to realization of this pledge that was given 75 years ago by our ancestors and our forefathers. But this is what is important, the emphasis that the High Commissioner for Human Rights has given to the government, and this is a hope. Please don't lose this foundation of hope. The world's hope lies in realization of these human rights. World peace is meaningful only when these human rights are being respected and honored. Let me stop here, and if you have questions, I'm more than happy to